We get to session 5 now, which is energy in our communities. And for those of you who were either with us this morning or who were watching on the live stream this morning, we know that the introduction that we did was about really the people involved in energy systems, and we're coming full circle now. This session, we're really going to be talking about the influence of energy systems on people, on communities, and different ways that we can look at that. And so we've got a lot of social scientists involved right now, which will make for a change of pace for all you technical folks. I'll feel a little bit more comfortable being a historian, so you can expect me to loosen up, but not the tie. So we've got subjects here: community and particular Aboriginal engagement in geothermal, disused wells, cities and greenhouse gases, life cycle of renewables, community reclamation, and economic incentives. This is all my language. Vivian Zong is going to start for us.
Thank you. First, I wish to thank and acknowledge my collaborators from Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation and the other collaborators at the University of Alberta and at the Royal Alberta Museum who have made this presentation possible. Geothermal energy has the potential to be the next transformative technology to boost Canada's green energy sector. Presently, British Columbia, Alberta, and the Yukon are the most viable areas to develop geothermal energy. Although geothermal energy is considered a clean, sustainable, and renewable energy resource, harnessing the geothermal energy is not without its risks. For example, geochemical precipitates contain toxic materials that are released when water under pressure underground are brought to the surface, and the extraction of large amounts of fluid can occur at a faster rate than natural aquifer replenishment. Renewable energy development projects typically are developed outside of urban centers. Thus, Indigenous communities living on reservations and rural resource-based communities are more disproportionately affected by industrial activities. Meaningful engagement and community consultation with Indigenous and rural communities will be key to successfully developing geothermal projects and other renewable projects, as well as policy throughout Canada. Article 32 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples emphasizes consultation and cooperation in good faith with Indigenous peoples in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before the start of any industrial activities that may affect their lands or other resources. Despite the Government of Canada and the Government of Alberta committing to implementing the United Nations Declaration, since 2017, the Supreme Court of Canada have issued 3 important rulings emphasizing the need to consult with Indigenous communities that are being affected by industry. Clearly, this demonstrates that the current consultation processes are broken and that we will require drastic changes to incorporate the principles found in the UN Declaration. The town of Hinton, Alberta is in the midst of a geothermal feasibility project. The Government of Alberta has designated Hinton as a case study to build upon its geothermal policies. However, the Indigenous communities in the area have not been formally consulted regarding this project. This project has the potential to affect the water resources in the Athabasca watershed, as well as land-based activities such as trapping, hunting, making sweats, as well as picking berries and medicines. There have not been any indications from the Government of Canada of Alberta for a timeline to conduct consultations on this energy development project, yet the study is still underway. Essentially, the feasibility of the geothermal energy project will determine when and whether the Government of Alberta will engage in consultations with Indigenous communities. This is against the spirit of the UN Declaration. Clearly, a new approach is required to decolonize the consultation process, not only for the proposed geothermal energy development in Canada, but for all renewable energy development across Canada. Our research aims to address how renewable energy systems can be developed in equitable and sustainable manners, respecting Indigenous rights, what policies or protocols need to be drafted or currently exist in consultation, which exist or need to be drafted in consultation with Indigenous communities, how Indigenous communities can participate meaningfully in consultation and engagement, and finally, how Indigenous community members can prepare for the process of transitioning to future renewable energy systems, or conversely, if they reject these systems, how they can resist. One approach to decolonizing the consultation process is to have the Indigenous communities lead research to identify the benefits and risks of geothermal energy development. Such an approach utilizes traditional scientific knowledge and intergenerational learning, and it allows the community to reach consensus regarding whether or not they want to proceed with geothermal energy development, which respects the community's right to self-determination as stated in the UN Declaration. Further, research guided by community objectives and governance processes provide the opportunity for transformation of relationships of power and in relationships between researchers, the indigenous communities, and the Crown. Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation has agreed to collaborate on this project to be co-investigators and co-creators of knowledge to identify oral histories, protocols, and risks as they pertain to geothermal energy in their traditional lands. As co-investigators, Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation and the university-based researchers will increase their mutual capacity for developing innovative energy research methodologies and understandings of self-governance mechanisms in geothermal energy. So I want you to look at these pictures of these rocks and just think, what do rocks mean to you in your lives? The oral traditions of First Nations have been cherished and deeply respected ways of communicating complex information about culture, politics, the environment, and economics. Tinker wrote, "Did you know that rocks can talk?" Well, they do. Yes, I'm aware that this is an audacious claim, even for an American Indian, made in the context of a world indelibly marked with accomplishments of modern science. But rocks talk and have what we must call consciousness. And we must extend our discussions of rocks to trees and to the rest of the created world around us. As the oldest and wisest of all life forms, rocks are to be deeply respected as a category, but especially as persons. So the University of Alberta researchers will be helping Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation and the Royal Alberta Museum together will be discovering how human and non-human relationships can inform geothermal energy. Through a collaboration with the Royal Alberta Museum, Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation is endeavoring to repatriate ceremonial bundles that are now housed at the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of the American Indian. Researchers based at the University of Alberta will help to identify the provenance of these bundles, and together we believe that these ceremonial bundles can inform protocols and oral histories regarding rocks, water, and the relationship between the land and people as it relates to geothermal energy. This research project aims to develop research skills among the youth living in Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation. A key aspect of this research process is the interaction between the elders and the youth living on the nation to identify and evaluate risks and to proactively explore what the introduction of geothermal energy in their communities might mean and whether to accept or reject development. The focus on intergenerational learning is critical because in the 5, 10, or 20 years that it might take to develop a geothermal energy project, the youth will become the next leaders. They will hold the traditional scientific knowledge for the community, and they will be responsible to be stewards of the land and to pass on that knowledge to the next generation of leaders. Not only that, another critical component in this research process is to facilitate interaction between the youth living in Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation, as well as non-Indigenous youth living in Hinton, to discuss the development of natural resources. Through encouraging empathy-based learning and dialogue in a circle format, youth participants will better understand the social, economic, cultural, environmental, and spiritual impacts of geothermal energy development from each other's viewpoints. As you can see on this picture, it's Liz Latondra, who is the director of the Archives and Repatriation Project at Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation with her student researchers. And then on your left is Kyla Cangiano, who will be working with the elders to learn more about the oral histories. My two co-supervisors are in the picture as well, Dr. Leanne Lessard and Dr. Andy Palmer. And I will be working with the youth specifically to learn more about how they conceptualize risk, as well as what geothermal might look like for them as they grow in the community as the next generation of leaders. Overall, this research aims to inform and develop equitable community engagement processes and frameworks for approaching renewable energy development responsibly and sustainably while respecting Indigenous rights to free, prior, and informed consent. Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation will use its traditional scientific knowledge, oral histories, ceremonies, and protocol to inform and develop a new model for approaching renewable energy development. As co-investigators and co-creators of knowledge, Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation will mobilize an innovative community engagement practice to increase community capacity in energy research and governance, and government agency capacity to listen and respond appropriately to community concerns. As Indigenous and non-Indigenous people living in Treaty 6 territories, we need to come together and recognize our relationships to one another, to the land, to the water, and through this historic treaty, through ceremony, we will be able to increase our mutual capacity for decolonizing the geothermal energy development, which will lead to a more sustainable energy future for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. Again, as the MC, I'm not allowed to have any bias, but as a Newfoundlander, I absolutely agree that rocks can talk. That's a joke that only a handful of Canadians in the room will know. Jen's laughing because she's from Halifax. We're from the east coast of this country. We don't make a lot of sense. Judges, are you ready for the next presentation? Okay, now they're looking at me weird. Let's get the timer ready to go. I will introduce Bandita Dekakalita, who is going to talk to us next for our 10-minute presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bandita Dekakalita, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the Alberta School of Business. And it's great to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present some of the work that myself and my supervisor, Joel Gaiman, have been doing over the past few months. And this project is entitled Holding the Tensions Together, and it is work that forms part of a larger umbrella project in which we're working on Alberta's legacy oil wells and how these are really looked at by the communities at large. Sorry. Okay, so I would like to spend a minute or two on the background to the study. As I mentioned, an overarching project that we are working on concerns with unproductive oil wells across Alberta. And these categories of wells, which are titled as, active, inactive, abandoned, orphaned, etc., we have this feeling, or data shows, that these are not uniformly understood and or agreed upon. And therefore, we felt that there was a need to objectively identify and dimensionalize the issue, and thus try to understand what kind of problems can arise from legacy oil wells, and whether these problems are really uniform for every section of the community, what kind of solutions exist to these problems, etc. So this was the background with which we started, and that inspired our initial research question, which was, what are the perspectives of various stakeholders on Alberta's growing inventory of legacy oil wells? We started out by enlisting the various stakeholders, and we came up with 8 categories. I will not, in the interest of time, I will not be going through all of them, but I would just like to point out a few that for which we have been able to collect data. The surface right owners, for example, are a group that are very heavily impacted because they hold the titles and thus the surface rights to the property on which these oil wells are situated. The oil companies obviously are an important stakeholder because they not only own, manage, and operate these wells, but they are also legally responsible to safely decommission these oil wells at the end of their life. Independent research groups, academic experts, and individuals are also important stakeholders to this problem, because through their research, they have an impact on society, they have an impact on the solutions to these problems. Therefore, they form a part of the stakeholders group as well. The research method, so for this project, we used a qualitative research method whereby we used 3 types of data: semi-structured interviews, meeting observations, and archival documents. And we used a grounded theory research design, whereby an iterative and abductive approach was followed with the goal of building and refining theory from data. So far we have collected a bit of data. We have 8 interviews, and we have sat through 2 meeting observations, and we've analyzed data with archival documents, primarily pertaining to the Alberta Energy Regulator, Orphan Well Association, and the Property Rights Advocate's Office. The trigger for our theoretical frame actually came up during our observation of a multi-stakeholder webinar that was conducted by an independent research group, and the diversity of background and the stakes of the various stakeholders who were involved in this particular seminar brought to fore some paradoxical tensions. Some competing demands that are contradictory yet interdependent. So we thought that was a very interesting frame for our project. The extant literature on paradox in management primarily deals with paradoxes emerging in the organizational context. Empirically single or multiple organizations have been studied, and many of these studies have found that working through paradoxes by engaging with them collaboratively instead of trying to disengage them can have favorable consequences for organizations. Now, our study kind of broadens the context in which paradoxes have been studied so far in the management literature, because we are taking it a step forward towards an entire industry with multiple stakeholders within and outside of it. This is how our data structure emerged using an abductive and iterative grounded theory approach. We first started with a first-order analysis where we tried to unpack the various components of the tensions and tried to find out what are the paradoxes that emerge from it and what are the various levels in which these are situated. So all of this was inspired by our reading of the theory. We found quite a few paradoxes, and we're still working through them. We're hoping to streamline these further. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I would like to mention a couple which I think are really important. The paradox of regulation, for instance, it refers to the finding that the accuracy of publicly available liability information, which is quite the topic in getting media attention these days, is subject to what the companies provide the regulator. And at the same time, these are the very companies that the regulator is regulating. So that is a paradox. The paradox of new technologies, for instance, refers to the finding that when you incentivize new technologies, sometimes this leads to less economic benefits because to spur innovative activities, you are providing incentives to these new technologies and thereby leading to a decline in productivity in existing technologies. So that is a paradox too. Now, these are the findings. How the stakeholders responded, we tried to look at this by looking at 2 dimensions of the data that we collected. The first dimension is that of on the y-axis is about sense-making approach, which basically refers to the processes that the stakeholders use to enact and interpret their environment. So the first was a group that adopted a paradox perspective, which is an acceptance of a both/and situation. And the second group had a dialectic perspective, which was kind of a resistance attitude or an either/or perspective to the problem. And along the x-axis, we looked at the stakeholders' implicit or explicit position with respect to where they found most value. So the first group said that the economic side of the triple bottom line affects me more, whereas the second group found that the socio-environmental side affects me more. So this is the analytical model that we have so far. So on your left are the tensions that I talked about, the field level, organizational level, and individual level paradoxical tensions. And how the stakeholders respond to these tensions are moderated by the 2 dimensions that I just described. And so the findings so far indicate that there are 6 types of responses of the stakeholders to these paradoxical tensions. And 4 out of these 6 have been identified in the literature before, but not in this context. So we are trying to kind of see if there are some other responses that might come to the fore and what's really going on here. Moving forward in our next steps, we would really like to unpack this more and try to understand the so what of this entire problem and try to see how would or have stakeholder responses affected this problem in Alberta, and what kind of dynamics do these responses entail, and what are the implications? In what ways can these paradoxes be really engaged with in such a manner that a sustainable solution can emerge from it? So that's kind of where we are trying to take this project forward, and that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Vandita. We'll give our judges just a moment. Get the timer reset, and Khan, we'll get ready. Judges, everybody's given us the thumbs up. Khan Rubaiyat is going to take us through another 10 minutes, our final 10-minute presentation of the day, in fact.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Khan Rahman, and I'm a postdoc fellow. I just joined here in September in the School of Urban and Regional Planning as a postdoc, and my supervisor is Dr. Sandeep Agarwal. So we are basically working with the issues of energy, city, and GHG emission in a Canadian context. So as I'm the only person working right now in the department with the future energy system, so I'm actually working really hard to find people and to extend my network and to understand what is going on in this future energy system projects in different dimensions. So before exploring the new idea and generating the new issues, we went back a little bit to see some literature related to three broad aspects, like energy, society, and GHG emission. How does it work? And how does it evolve in a Canadian context? And mostly in the city areas, because we are mostly focusing on communities, neighborhoods at city scale. So we tried to investigate what are the kind of inherent relationships in these three major issues in Canada. So I'll be touching some specific issues about background in today's presentation, and the research question we actually brought into action at this point, and the method we are trying to employ or trying to adopt, and some of the results, and moving forward and concluding remarks with some challenges that are actually faced by the research team. So to give a little background, if you just take a look in these two figures, the first figure it is actually talking about the megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in Canadian, in Canada actually. This is the national kind of report, and there are some future predictions. So if you take a look, in 2017 it started, and different kind of scenarios are giving different, kind of ideas, like what's going on in Canada about GHG emissions, because we are very much active in, once we sign the Paris Protocol, so we are very much active to work on climate change issues and to reduce the greenhouse gases. So the forecast and the predicted models did not give us any kind of optimism, because the most important one produced by the Canadian government on the top, if you can see, it's called a second biennial report, and it referred that 815 megatons of carbon will be emitting in 2030. So that is almost like around almost 75 megatons, up in next 30 years. But some kind of optimist people, they said it will be, reducing at some point. So we wanted to measure all those things with our own model and with our own criteria, and we wanted to check if those models are predicting quite accurate, or if we could validate them with our own model. So if we just take a look on the second figure and the bottom figure, you can see the energy demand in Canada. So the demand is growing. For example, just take a quick look. If you just make a phone call to someone, if he's busy, your phone says the phone is busy, please try again later. But whenever you warming up your food in a microwave oven, if you put the food inside the oven and the microwave tells you please wait 3 minutes, then I'll be warming up, you will be really feeling not that good and comfortable. So you want it immediately. Think about it like the computer you turned on again here. the computer says, okay, wait like 10 minutes, the energy is, like coming back. You'll be feeling really uncomfortable. So this is not how the community actually respond, right? So we wanted to see, like, if the demand is increasing and how much is it increasing in Canada-wide, in nationwide, and then to city level. So if you just take a look of this one also about the carbon dioxide emissions equivalent in different provinces, you see like the Atlantic provinces, they're kind of a little bit reddish, and we are also sitting in the reddish part, like Saskatchewan and Alberta. We are also, like consuming too much energy for different reasons. I'm not gonna talk about that, but what I'm just gonna talk like because of the consumption of energy from different sources, we are emitting more carbon. So the energy demand, which sector actually the demand is coming from, that is also important for us to know. Then we can actually involve the community to reduce the carbon and the greenhouse gas emission. So we found like in Calgary and Alberta, if you see, like in and Edmonton, both places in Alberta, you see like the transportation sector is actually exerting more pressure for getting more energy. So this is kind of alarming for us to like introduce new things, and the new policies have been already taken by the governments, and you might see some like electronic vehicle and automatic vehicles, so many things. And in Montreal, it's important that like in Montreal, the transportation sector is kind of urging more energy over the time period. And everywhere it says like the transportation sector is one of the major areas the energy is kind of like demanding. Why is that? Because people, the urbanization is growing, and the people are coming into the country and in the city life, and they want to enjoy themselves with a lot of cars, and a lot of transportation demands are coming across. And then it comes to like the industrial activities, residential buildings, and commercial buildings. And we did not actually consider agriculture because we are trying to focus on city level, so we did not actually consider agriculture in that aspect. So if you see like the major cities in Canada, the CO2 emissions in ton, you see like Calgary and Edmonton is really sitting on top. Like both of them are in Alberta. And in the left-hand side, you can see in Calgary, and Edmonton is the right-hand side, so it's on the top. So a question may come, why is it top in Edmonton? So definitely there are several reasons, because maybe the city is growing, and also we are like asking more energy because of our heating system to work properly. Many different activities are there. But what we actually came up with, like Edmonton is asking more energy, and like also generating more GHG emissions into the atmosphere. So the research question came here: can we plan a city or a neighborhood for future, not today, like based on its energy and emission production scenarios? Like the existing consideration we will be studying, and based on that we'll be recommending, okay, if the new neighborhood or city should be designed in a kind of sustainable way so that the GHG emission could be minimized. It should not be like going in business as usual protocol. The method we try to employ, like we call LEAP model, that is generated from Stockholm Environmental Institute. And we are considering different kind of data set to run the model. The first one is energy intensity data, and the second one GHG emission scenarios from different sources, and energy demand and consumption scenarios at neighborhood level, and the housing, commercial, and transportation sector analysis too. So this is one of the kind of model. We did not actually build it by ourselves because we got help from the city people, city of Edmonton. So this CO2 emission scenarios shows us the business as usual model in the first one. If we do the same kind of things, it will be really getting worse over the time period. But if we actually do something like business as planned, the city has a plan. And if we actually go in that plan, it will be minimizing, but not that much. So the accelerated business as usual plan means you actually intervene some important issues into it, like maybe we can introduce a new railway track line or railway line. There might be some, less emission of carbon production in the greenhouse gas production. That is kind of accelerate BAP. And the DOP is called the Paris Protocol. The delivery of protocol in the Paris Agreement is actually telling us, like, if we want to put the 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature in next 30 years for the Earth's surface, then we should actually employ this model, so DOP model. Then it shows like the commercial, industrial, and every sector needs to reduce the greenhouse gas a lot. And there is the plus DOP model, the Paris Agreement. We already signed in that agreement, so we are obliged to do that. So the city of Edmonton also signed in that agreement too. So they are also obliged to, follow this rule. Because of that, we need to cut, different kind of sectors to save energy and to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. So based on that, the communities and the neighborhood has responsibilities. It's not like the researchers, it's not like the engineers, it's not like the sophisticated model builders. They will be doing everything. So the city needs to engage people, and it's for the people. So if they don't actually come forward, then we cannot do anything. So because of that, we had some plan to do some engagement with the communities that we have not done yet. And the sustainable energy planning, which area should be focused in the city's plan, because they are also building a new plan right now. And like the strategies for negating the GHG emission, like the walkability, riding more bicycle, and those kind of things, we are also figuring things out. And the concluding remarks is that the main challenge we are facing right now to get the data set, because the exact data set, where it is located, where can we find, that is the major, like a burning question for us right now. And we are also collaborating to obtain those data sets from different set of people and different communities. And at neighborhood level data, like even the city, they don't want to give it to us, because then I can easily say, like, okay, this building is emitting more GHG emission in the atmosphere, so it means that building is not good, and we will say, okay, the owner should not be left like that. So there should be some regulatory measures. So that's it from my presentation, and there are some useful references, and if you want to contact me, you're always welcome to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Con. And that's it for 10-minute presentations today. We'll give the judges just a minute. They're chatting. Alicia's getting the timer warmed up. We're about to go into our final 3-minute theses. They're muttering to each other. They're looking at me. They're good now. I don't know about that. So, to pivot to our last 3-minute theses, first up, Arshdeep Kugikat.
So let's assume that when you go to office tomorrow, you have a pleasant surprise waiting for you. Your employer, as a part of the Go Green initiative of his company, wants to gift you a brand new electric car. Sounds exciting, isn't it? But let me tell you something. 87% of Alberta's electricity is from natural gas and coal resources. So what this means is that though your car might be silent and emission-free, but the electricity that is driving your car during generation did actually produce some GHG gases, thus polluting the environment. So after all, your boss is not always right. So this brings me to the concept of sustainable design. So what happens in sustainable design is that we evaluate the environmental performance of a particular product or technology throughout its life cycle and not just through the use phase. And this is exactly my research is all about. We provide insights about the environmental performance of a particular product or technology throughout its life cycle and also conduct techno-economic assessments. So I started off with looking into a number of technologies that are being developed under future energy systems and put them into 3 different categories. And finally, based on the feasibility flow diagram, we did select a few technologies, and I did get an opportunity to meet a lot of people from these selected projects to assimilate more information. And that's when I crossed paths with one of the teams here at the university working on fabricating perovskite solar cells. I did know that solar cells have the capacity to produce electricity without generating too much GHG, but then little did I know that silicon, which is one of the major raw materials for producing silicon solar cells, takes up loads of energy during extraction and upgradation, so much so that it will have to produce energy for the next 2.5 years loyally to give back the energy that it took up during its manufacturing. So this is really crazy, and that's where we have to find alternatives, and perovskite solar cells can be seen as one. Interested by the architecture of perovskite solar cells, we conducted life cycle assessment around this perovskite solar cells, and we actually considered the overall energy consumption as well as the life cycle emissions of this technology and identified the hotspots. This is what we found by the preliminary results. TiO2 anode, which is used, can contribute 30.1%, and gold, which is used in very small quantities, can still contribute 16.7% towards the GHG emissions throughout the life cycle. So what this type of study does is, with results as these, we can actually find alternatives around this and make this more sustainable, and that way government can frame policies around that. And also, it can grab the attention of the investors. That's what we want. And finally, we will also conduct techno-economic assessment of this technology or product and to understand the economic viability. So thank you very much. That's my time.
Thank you very much, Vice Chief. I don't know about that whole your boss is not always right thing, though. I don't know if we're allowed to have subversive thinking like that. Kylie Heels is doing our next penultimate 3-minute talk.
Thanks, Kenneth. I'm Kylie Heels, a first-year PhD student at the Alberta School of Business, and along with my first-year counterpart, Maggie Cascadden, here in the front row, and our PIs, Dev Jennings, up the back, and Nathan Professor Gamil Aldin, we're doing a multidisciplinary collaborative study which looks at community stakeholder engagement in wetland design. So we're bringing together science and social science together to look at the effects of reclamation. So we're really wanting to question the assumption that if we engage stakeholders in society, that the scientific outcomes will go down as a result of that engagement. And we are positing that that's not actually true. And we're going to test this in the domain of passive wetland construction on wastewater reclamation. So what we're going to do is put to a team of stakeholders 4 different wetlands designs. You can see one on the screen at the moment, which is design A. And we're going to describe to them these different features. So what is actually involved in wetlands reclamation? And then we're going to ask them to rank these different models on biophysical designs as well as stakeholder outcomes. Now, there's 2 different ways that we can engage stakeholders on a spectrum of community engagement. So the first one is a town hall setup. So that's similar to what we're doing right now. I'm standing here and just giving you information. Then we've got more of a co-design option, which we actually heard a little bit about in the first 10-minute speech today, and it's more of this consensus building concept. So these are the 2 extremes of community engagement we're going to apply. So in stage 1, as I mentioned, all 4 wetland designs are given to the stakeholders in different types of community engagement, and then they're going to measure these DVs on biophysical measures and stakeholder measures. And then what we're actually going to do is simulate something that we see quite often in the real world, which is once engineering and science solutions get out in the field, we need to adapt to environmental conditions. And so that means that sometimes the stakeholders don't get exactly what they expected. So we're simulating this unmet expectation and telling stakeholders, you recommended as a community wetland design A, but actually what we need to do, given the conditions, is wetland design C. And then we're going to ask them to remeasure the different dependent variables associated with this. So what we expect to find is that regardless of the type of stakeholder engagement, the better designs from the science team will be scored higher by stakeholders. We hope that maintains its case in unmet expectations, but what we actually expect to see is some sort of threshold. So when there's an unmet expectation of stakeholders, they actually retaliate by marking wetland designs lower. So that's our contribution. Thanks.
Thank you, Kylie. One more 3-minute pitch.
Boreal cable herds in Alberta continue to be under pressure from human disturbances to their habitat more than 5 years after the development of federal threatened species recovery strategy. Land use by the energy sector, including the development of seismic lines like this, is largely responsible for the decline in caribou population in Alberta. Although oil sands firms are required to reclaim their land at the end of their project, the so-called legacy seismic lines still generate land damage during energy production. If we do not take effective measures to restore land early, caribou may disappear in the near future. To an economist, a tax could create an incentive to reclaim land early, but we understand nobody likes taxes. That is why we explore a tax refund scheme. Specifically, we investigate a policy that collects taxes from firms based on the land damage they impose, and then repay firms based on the land energy output in the same period. Using the land use information and the data on in-situ oil sands firms, we construct a simulation model to assess the reclamation decisions, caribou population impacts, and economic outcomes under 3 different cases. The current case, the tax case, and the tax refund case. If we maintain the current land use practice and take no other actions, there will be few caribou left in 30 years. If we levy taxes, the caribou population will theoretically increase because of reclamation, but the tax policy may not be politically feasible. If we levy taxes and then repay firms, we expect to get the same desirable caribou results with little adverse economic impact. So, the tax refund scheme could be used as a strategy for caribou recovery through habitat reclamation. It also provides insights about dealing with abandoned wells on private land and speeding up reclamation efforts for other renewable and non-renewable energy projects that have adverse land use impacts. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So that's it. That's all the students and postdocs who are going to be presenting today, and I've got a few announcements. First of all, to everybody who's watching on our live stream, thank you. Thank you for joining us today.